All right. We good? All right. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Congresswoman Kat Cammack, proudly representing the Gator Nation, Florida's 3rd Congressional District, also the horse capital of the world. But we're not here to have a competition about whose district is better. We're here to talk about the most popular bill in Congress today, the REINS Act. With 179 co-sponsors, this bill has become front and center for the Republican agenda in reining in this overreaching, overburdensome government that has spiraled out of control. I like to say that the regulatory regime is quite literally the biggest but the quietest American dream killer. It has an impact on every aspect of our lives, from the services that we use to the products that we consume to the way we operate our businesses. The regulatory regime is out of control and dictating every element of our livelihoods, our businesses, and beyond. Currently, there are 1.3 million regulations on the books, costing our economy over $2 trillion a year. It's pretty simple. You start pulling regulations off the books that don't make people safer, products safer, and they're really there just to find a home and to drive revenue for that agency. We can start to see some relief for the American people. The REINS Act does just this. It takes steps to address regulatory actions by requiring every new major rule proposed by federal agencies to be approved by Congress before going into effect. A great example is this week, the ATF will publish a rule on stabilizing braces that will have a $1.9 billion impact to the industry, but also will make millions of law-abiding citizens felons in the span of 120 days. Specifically, the House and Senate would be required to pass a joint resolution in order for a major rule to be approved by Congress. This bill defines a major rule as any federal rule or regulation that may result in an annual effect on the economy of $100 million or more, a major increase in cost prices for consumers, individual industries, government agencies, or geographic regions, or significant adverse effects on competition, employment, investment, productivity, innovation, or the ability of US-based enterprises to compete with foreign-based enterprises. This bill also preserves the ability for Congress to disapprove of non-major rules. With that includes all rules that do not qualify as a major rule through a joint resolution of disapproval. So Congress is permitted constitutionally to decide major questions of nationwide policy. The REINS Act would bolster that mandate that Congress has by approving costly executive actions before they go into place. Florida, for example, requires legislative approval of all rules that adversely impact the economy or increase regulatory costs of at least $1 million over 5 years. Seems pretty simple to me. Lawmakers can prevent agencies from using guidance that they take quite liberally to circumvent the congressional review process. We can protect taxpayers, tame inflation, increase transparency, novel idea, and rein in the executive branch. In short, Congress can fundamentally protect taxpayers and job creators by restoring a constitutional balance of power by reining in the federal bureaucracy for good. Just for points of reference, in my home state of Florida, inflation is costing families about $875 a month. That's more than $10,180 annually. I don't know many families in my district that have an extra 10 grand to spare. At the end of 2020, groceries were up more than $105 per month. For folks that are on fixed income, this is real. The impact that the regulatory environment is having on us is real. And since I don't like bureaucrats in basements all over Washington wasting our tax dollars, I'm not going to waste your time. You understand the importance of this bill, but I want my colleagues to share their experiences and what they are excited about within this bill to take on the regulatory state. So with that, I would like to introduce my friend, our whip, Mr. Tom Emmer from the great state of Minnesota.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name's Tom Emmer, and I'm proud to represent Minnesota's 6th Congressional District, and as Kat mentioned, the privilege of serving as a majority whip in the House of Representatives. I want to thank Congresswoman Cammack for inviting me today and for her taking the lead on such an important issue. We must recognize the statement that she opened with, that there are over 140 of our colleagues who signed on as original co-sponsors to the REINS Act. Under President Biden, a concerning trend has escalated to a catastrophic crisis. Our economy continues to be weighted down with ever larger regulatory burdens. While Americans grapple with 40-year high inflation due to the Biden administration's failed policies, regulations during the first 2 years of this administration have cost our economy almost $309 billion. We cannot trust a bloated federal government to hold itself accountable. It's time for Congress to halt the overreach of these federal agencies and hold unelected bureaucrats accountable. We are proud to support the REINS Act, and the Republican majority will continue to fight to end the Biden administration's unchecked power grab. Thank you, and I will turn it over to
Mr. Rutherford.
Mr. Rutherford. John Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Whip. And listen, I have to tell you, back 6 years ago, when I first ran for Congress, the REINS Act was being talked about back home then. And Kat, I want to thank you for bringing this back up. We've got to get this done. It's a bill whose time has come, and I can tell you that I'm very happy to be here talking about this bill again, because what we've seen over the last several years is more and more of executive branch agencies and this administration who are literally legislating by fiat through the rule process. When you have a 1,200-page rule, that's not a rule, that's legislation. And that has to be stopped, and that's what this bill is all about. The fact that we can have $100 million of impact from a rule, and nobody that was elected by anyone in this country would be involved in that process. Just bureaucrats. That's what has to change. Look, our founders put Congress in charge of writing laws, not these unelected bureaucrats at federal agencies. In November, House Republicans promised voters that we were going to hold the government accountable. This bill will do just that. And with that, I yield back to Representative Barr. Andy?
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Rutherford. My name is Andy Barr. I represent Central Kentucky in the U.S. House, the true horse capital of the world. But I do want to thank my good friend from the second most important horse district in America, Kat Cammack, for her leadership on this bill. And a bit of history. We call it the REINS Act, the Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act. But it comes from originally a Kentucky Congressman, Jeff Davis, about over a decade ago, who played a little bit on that horse theme of reining in the out-of-control rulemaking and administrative law that's coming out of unaccountable, unelected bureaucrats. Another bit of history is constitutional history. It is often said that the rise of the administrative state is a 20th century and 21st century phenomenon to give experts, policymaking experts, the ability to deal with problems of modern society that legislators just simply don't have time to deal with. The truth of the matter is, this is not a new phenomenon. This is an ancient phenomenon of absolutism and despotism that the framers of our Constitution specifically prohibited in the Constitution. It's called the non-delegation doctrine. The first substantive provision of the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution, says that all legislative power shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, a House and a Senate. All is the key word, meaning no legislative power is given to unaccountable, unelected bureaucrats in the executive branch. This important bill restores that fundamental constitutional balance and restores legislative prerogatives to this body, the elected representatives of the American people, and I'm proud to support this effort. I yield back, and we'll yield to Representative Bice from Oklahoma.
I'm not sure how you follow Andy Barr from Kentucky with that narrative, but I will try. First of all, I want to say thank you all for being here and thank my friend, classmate, Kat Cammack, for putting this bill forward. The American people deserve a government that they can trust. The Biden administration has overstepped the legislative branch to repeatedly tack on burdensome regulations that are the root cause of some of the crises we're seeing today, especially in the energy sector, which is so important to my home state. Look no further than the Waters of the U.S. rule, which greatly increases the number of bodies of water that are subject to federal regulation and places an undue burden on farmers and ranchers. This is a clear violation of property rights, and yet another example of how the government agencies are overreaching into our daily lives. Similarly, the SEC emissions disclosure proposed rule is not only unnecessary, but it is also a burden on businesses that'll stifle economic growth. The SEC is supposed to regulate securities and protect investors, not regulate emissions and focus on environmental concerns. The Biden administration's effort to ban gas stoves is the latest attempt to force the Green New Deal on all Americans who rely heavily on gas-powered stoves and heaters, myself included. It's astonishing how out of touch they are with the needs of the American people. These rules are just another example of the executive overreach and their attempt to control our aspect of life. It is hardworking Oklahomans that are bearing the brunt of these regulations. We need to safeguard property rights, businesses, and the way of life. And I am very proud to join my colleagues that stand before you and many others who are not here to support the REINS Act, which will protect Americans and rein in our federal bureaucracy. Thank you. And at this time, I would invite Rep. Henson up. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, everybody, for coming out today to talk about this very important issue. Thank you, Congresswoman Cammack, for your leadership here as well. This is not a new problem. For years and over several administrations, we have seen the executive branch take more and more power for itself, empowering those bureaucrats while taking that power away from the American people and circumventing Congress at the same time. In just 1 year, the Biden administration added more than $200 billion in new regulatory costs through their heavy-handed rulemaking, pulling down our economy, putting that burden on our small businesses, and inserting the government in a place it doesn't belong. So one of the most egregious examples, which I'm thankful my colleague from Oklahoma brought up, is WOTUS, and brought a little little visual aid here. The Biden administration finalized this rule in December through one of their holiday weekend data dumps, which we are coming to expect from this administration. But under this rule, take a look at this map. 97% of the state of Iowa would be subject to regulation. So as you can see, just those little, my colleagues here, all these little white dots, right? That's the only part of the state of Iowa that would not be subject to this rule from the Biden administration. 97% of the land. This would be devastating for our farmers, for our producers, and our landowners. And rather than going through Congress to have this discussion where they would rightfully face some stiff opposition from representatives like myself and Representative Nunn from Iowa, they have decided to forge ahead on their own and ram these rules and regulations through. So that is why we have introduced the REINS Act, legislation that will force the administration to rein it in quite literally. So any new rule proposed by the administration would be subject to approval by the House and the Senate. And this goes for all administrations as well. It would hold unelected bureaucrats accountable, and it would be making sure that they can stop imposing costly regulations on Iowans and all Americans with simply the stroke of a pen. We need to put a stop to it. So again, thank you to Congresswoman Cammack for her leadership on this issue. And I look forward to working with my colleagues this Congress to make sure we get this bill over the finish line, take that power from the bureaucrats, and return it to the people where it rightfully belongs. And now it's my honor to introduce my colleague, my friend from North Carolina, Congressman Dr. Murphy.
Good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank Representative Cammack for resurrecting this bill, long overdue. We were all elected to come here and drain the swamp, right? That was what the great moniker was, come and drain the swamp. And everybody thinks it's always the elected officials. We have some elected officials, some of which actually have been here 50 years, believe it or not. One of them is the most prominent place in the city. We have other officials that are here just a couple years. But what we have is we find out what the true swamp is. What is the true swamp? They're the unelected individuals, the unelected bureaucrats that move agencies at the pace of a large cargo ship. And what they do, however, is they direct rules, they direct regulations without ever being elected that affect every American's life. We hear examples now, the waters of the U.S. I look at CMS that promulgates 11,000 pages of rules every year. Recently, there's another rule by NOAA that permits and it prevents rather any vessel over 35 feet in length from traveling faster than 10 miles an hour until they're 20 miles offshore. That will literally cause recreational and commercial fishing to die overnight. These are rules by unelected bureaucrats, appointed and pushed forth and financed by, given direction by our executive branch. That's not the way our founding fathers had it work. So what we're trying to do, and it's a perfect moniker, perfect anagram, is to pull the reins back on federal spending. $100 million is a lot of money. That money is not to be directed by individuals who are not elected by the American populace. So this legislation, and I'm really, really glad that Representative Cammack has brought this back up, is starting to bring common sense back to this country. And if we're ever going to get this deficit dealt with, that's what it deals with. It has to deal with common sense. So thank you all for attending, and thank you for all my colleagues for highlighting this very important issue. And with that, I will bring up my one and dear, dear friend, Representative McClain.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank y'all. And first and foremost, I want to thank my colleague and my friend, Representative Cammack. What you have done bringing this legislation forth again with your passion around spending and really around putting the power back into the people's hand, we've got to applaud you. So thank you so much for doing that. At the end of the day, this is common sense legislation. Last time I read Article 1 of the Constitution, I didn't see anything in there about unelected bureaucrats getting to make rules in this country. Right? Think about that. That is the duty and the responsibility of Congress. And that duty and that responsibility was given to us by the people. Let's put the power back in the people's hands because we are a representative government of the people. Have some trust, have some faith in people, have some faith in the human race for goodness sake. I mean, people will do the right thing. Let's have a little hope. Let's have a little positivity. The bottom line is the bureaucrats in these federal agencies have way too much power, little accountability anyways, too, and the regulations they create cost taxpayers trillions of dollars. But these unelected bureaucrats don't care because it's not their money. It's your money. We cannot let this continue. The government is already too big and too powerful, and it's time to put the power back into the people's hands. And again, I want to thank my dear friend and colleague for bringing this up again and all of the support that you have. Have a little faith and trust in the American people. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're good. You're good.
Story got away from me.
Up next, I'd like to recognize one of our newest freshmen from the great state of Iowa, from the 3rd District, Representative Zach Nutt.
Well, thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Congresswoman. Kat Cammack is truly not just a leader in this, but she has led the charge for 197 of our colleagues who truly want to see a rein-in on what our federal government is doing. Now, I'm from the heartland, little place called Iowa, home to a good friend called John Wayne. And Kat Cammack has shown true grit in standing up to the type of overreach that the federal government's attempting to do. Imagine a situation right now where an Iowan goes to bed on that family farm, or closes the door on their doctor's office, or shuts down their small insurance firm at the end of the week, and only to wake up the next morning and find that they are now liable to an unelected group of bureaucrats who have changed the game for them, who've now had an impact on whether they get to open up that business again, or whether they potentially face a criminal penalty or even jail time for something that unelected bureaucrats have changed without their say-so. Now, as elected officials, we would not have the opportunity to do that without answering to those voters on a very direct basis at our next town hall. But in Washington, you can change the game at night and can leave it on somebody else's doorstep to have to deal with, to the tune of trillions of dollars being impacted in additional costs on family farms, on the single mothers, and on small front businesses. Look, you've got a great team up here who has stood up to what's going on in Washington, D.C., and held not only the administration accountable, but helped those small communities truly have the opportunity to survive. In my district alone, we had an individual who was audited 27 times over the course of 2 decades, only to find out that it was actually the IRS who owed him money. And he put tens of thousands of his own dollars into hiring an attorney. Look, this is the reality. We have good people out there who want to do the right thing. Let's help them do that. The REINS Act ensures that Congress, the elected officials, are going to be the ones who are making those decisions, not the bureaucrats in basements in Washington. Congresswoman Cammack, thank you for taking the lead on this.
Also, one of our outstanding freshmen, I would like to introduce at this time, Mr. Mike Collins from the great state of Georgia, also a truck driver by trade. So he can speak to regulations at length, but you get 2 minutes.
You know, I was back here bouncing around like a cat on a hot tin roof. You know, and I guess I want to take this in a kind of a different perspective. Yeah, I've spent the last 30 plus years of my life in probably one of the most regulated industries that there is in this country, and that is the trucking industry. As a matter of fact, when we ran and spoke with a lot of other small businesses, we find out that it's the same thing across the country in almost every industry. It is just the fact that you have got such an overreach from the federal government, from a fourth branch of government called bureaucrats that aren't elected to anything, that are out there regulating and sticking more regulations. And a lot of times you don't really find out what that regulation is until you get the violation. And to the point to where, and I'm going to tell you something, small businesses are the backbone of this country. And the regulations that have been imposed across this country on small businesses are what are putting them out of business, to the point where they either have to close shop or sell out to somebody bigger that it can afford to hire enough people just to comply with the crazy regulation that's been imposed on them. That's what's got to stop. That's also the type of things that run businesses off of the shores of America and into other countries because they can't afford to comply with these crazy regulations that we have up here. That's going to stop. One of the main things we campaigned on was getting involved with the REINS Act. And Congresswoman, I can't thank you enough for putting that up there. I hadn't been up here a month, and it's been incredible what we've been able to see being accomplished and what's being passed and pushed across to the Senate to get passed over there. I look forward to being a part of this, and I look forward to supporting this bill, and I appreciate the few minutes to get up there and speak about it.
At this time, I'd like to turn it over to another outstanding freshman from New York, Mr. Langworthy.
Hello, thank you so much, and I really want to salute you, Representative Cammack, for bringing this bill forward. It's so important. I had the privilege of serving on a presidential transition and saw just the fact that only 5,000 faces changed from one administration to the next, just what the size and scope of the federal bureaucracy really has become. Members of Congress on both sides of the aisle are accountable to our constituents and the taxpayers of this country. They're overburdened, they're overregulated, and that has to stop. You know, the accountability sitting with the members of Congress is what's so important, and we have to take action in order to take the powers back that our Constitution has laid out and from the founders. The executive branch has gotten too big, too strong, and the bureaucracy is driving the train. So thank you for leading this effort, and I look forward to this bill's passage.
And going to the other side of the country, I'd like to bring up my good friend and our final speaker from the great state of California, Mr. Doug LaMalfa.
Yeah, thank you. In addition to all those oranges and horses she has down there, I'm also really excited about her representation of the original Swamp Rat, the greatest drag racer ever, Don Garlitz, down in her district there. So I come from Northern California. We have some of the most craziest regulations there. Simultaneously, in what is the current California, we have a drought emergency and we have a flood emergency. Can you imagine that? It's because we've had a lot of rain lately, and due to regulation, we're not as prepared for it with our levees, our water handling systems. Instead, we get our water taken away from us in agriculture. This in the time where we got $7, $8 dozen eggs. In the west half of the valley I represent, 250,000 acres of land were left out because of no water. It was indeed directed to other uses due to biological opinions and other things made by bureaucrats that don't really seem to care about what the people need in this country, in my home state, in agriculture and whatever. So Waters of the United States is yet another overreach that was pushed back for a while. It's alive and kicking once again and going to put people out of business, make food less affordable, less available for so many people, all because they want to regulate every single mud puddle, the water coming off your roof into a rain barrel, a man-made ditch in a drainage or an irrigation district. They believe it all belongs to them. And that's not the case. These are property rights that are in peril, and these are the people's needs that are in peril for their ability to afford what they need to do to put food on the table. And for the farmers that we're still going to need, unless we want to import all of our food, which works really great when you compare that to imported energy. So we have to rein these people back, because a lot of times when you're trying to get answers from them on how to deal with this regulation, they're not even at work. They won't even answer the phone, so we can figure out what the blank we're supposed to do with these people. I appreciate the time. Kat, thanks so much for taking the reins on this issue.
I knew at some point that was going to be said. So folks, you've heard today, the regulatory regime is impacting everyday Americans. Regulators across the basements all around Washington, D.C., you are now on notice. You may be the regulators, but this is the deregulation team. And there's 179 of us today. Tomorrow there will be more, and we will keep going until we dismantle this bureaucratic state that has absolutely started the process of killing the American dream. We never start these press conferences on time. We never end them on time. So this is a miracle in itself that we have started, and we have 3 minutes for questions. Does anyone have any questions? So no timeline on when this will hit the floor, but leadership is aware. We see this as an opportunity to really address some of the reckless spending in Washington. This is going to be a very powerful tool in the toolbox, and leadership is excited about this. On that note, I'd also like to say on the other side of this Capitol building, Senator Rand Paul, who has sponsored this bill for the better part of a decade, he is reintroducing the Senate version, the Senate companion version, and is excited about the momentum that they're building on the Senate side.
How does this bill impact emergency regulations? A lot of controversy during the COVID. Some regulations that were made, some that not stayed in place too long, but others that were given. How would that work?
So I think under an emergency declaration, that's unprecedented, right? And I think most of us up here, if not all, would agree that we're well past the time to roll back the emergency declaration for COVID. One of the things that we are focusing on are the big ticket items that are driving our deficit, driving our debt. And certainly we have started that process of looking for where the fraud, the waste, and abuse with COVID spending and regulatory environments have occurred. But this problem is so much bigger than just the emergency environment in a once-in-a-lifetime type pandemic. We're talking about generations that have endured red tape every single day in every single product, in every service, in every aspect and corner of our life. So while that is a part of it, I think we're focused on the bigger picture of how do we rein in the regulatory environment in this regime that's continuing to suppress our economic opportunity here. Last call? All right.
Thank you.
You know, I think our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, they face the exact same issues that we do when we go home. Their constituents are faced with the exact same red tape. Their constituents are faced with the high gas prices, with high cost of food. They have folks that are on fixed incomes that they have to answer to. And the answer, and I think we all, again, I'm not going to I only speak for myself, but I think by and large, we have figured out that throwing money at a problem does not make it go away. And continuing to tie people up in industries in red tape does not make the problems better. It makes them worse. So I think for the sake of their constituencies, Democrats ought to be taking a serious look at this, because if they are for accountability, if they're for transparency, and they are for the Constitution of which they took an oath to, they would sign on to this bill and vote for this bill, because it returns that power back to Congress where it was originally intended, and they are reasserting their role in the three branches of government. Not four, three. I appreciate you all for being here. Thank you so much. And thank you to my colleagues for your time and your comments today. I so appreciate it. And look at that. We ended on time. Have a great day, y'all.
You are amazing.